Hello, and welcome to the Mindful Movement Podcast. I'm your host, Les Raymond. Thanks for tuning in today for another episode. I got to speak with Mike Dubrovsky, the co-founder of Siphox today. Siphox is doing some really interesting work. They are transforming the industry of monitoring blood. So if you care about your health, you probably have an understanding that the molecules floating around in your blood can say a lot about what's going on behind the scenes in regards to your health. And there's a lot of value in measuring it. It's hard to fix what you're not measuring. And traditionally, measuring blood kind of sucks. The whole process of going to the doctor and going to a lab and getting blood drawn is just not fun. And Siphox is really transforming the way it's done. They're making it way easier. It takes just a few drops of blood. You could do it from the comfort of your home. They do all the work, and they create an interface where you could visually see and track how the markers of your blood are changing over time. So I'm really excited about it. I've kind of monitored my blood over the last several years and more thoroughly when I was going through a bit of a healing crisis. So I definitely understand the value of it, and I understand that it can be really cumbersome. And personally, I just hate the whole process of giving blood and seeing the vials filled up and occasionally getting lightheaded and such. So I'm excited to use the product. They were nice enough to offer a discount, so we'll link to that in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Mike Dubrovsky, thanks for joining me on the Mindful Movement Podcast.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
So at the Mindful Movement, I guess one of the big things that we focus on is empowering folks to play a larger role in their sense of well-being. And I feel like the product that you've helped co-found with Siphox kind of speaks directly to that. You make a product that makes it really easy for people to monitor their blood markers and kind of track the wellness aspects that they don't necessarily see or necessarily feel, kind of the behind the scene. And there's definitely a convenience factor to that of being able to do it from your own home. I tested the product recently. It was an interesting process. What brought you to wanting to create such product?
That's a great question. So the truth is, my background originally is in chemistry and biology. I then went on to start a few startups, actually not even in that space, more like electric vehicle charging. And then I eventually got into this little sub niche while I was doing grad school research in first at Technion, and then I was later at MIT, and I got into this little niche called silicon photonics. Which is actually very important. So right now, we're having this conversation through Zoom. Seems like a digression, but it'll end up being important. So we're having this conversation through Zoom, and our computers use electronics, it's all electrons. But actually, the data is communicated using light through fiber optics, and that's why we're all able to be connected, because there are these fibers literally laying on the bottom of the ocean, laying in the ground, strung up, whatever, all over the world. And that's why we can all, have these kinds of connections remotely. And it used to be that at the end of every fiber, there was a big box full of optics that would convert it into electronic signals so computers could understand them. But that's all been miniaturized onto silicon chips, similar to the chips in a phone. So also produced in these big foundries. Maybe you've heard of this. There's all these chip wars going on of, the best chip foundries in Taiwan, and China wants it and all these things. Anyway, so this happened about 10 years ago. It really kicked off, got going really significantly. And now everywhere, there are these silicon chips doing this communication. And it turns out that blood testing, that when you open a tool, when you send your blood to a lab, that tool inside is full of optics. So it turns out that basically it's a logical next step for that technology to miniaturize blood testing. And that's something that people have been working on for a while, but it's really become so mature that when we started the company, we actually didn't start with a blood test. We just started with the more general technology around optics, how to miniaturize optics. But we realized that there's this incredible opportunity to fix a problem that's been around for a while, which is just that, people get 10 data points a decade from blood tests. And typically, because the blood tests are expensive and cumbersome and everything else, you don't really get that many markers tested. They just test you for the ones where, if you're literally something is completely gone wrong, then you'll know from that. So they'll do like, blood count. So if you have cancer, you might see that in the blood count, that kind of thing. But actually, there are lots of markers that turn out to be really well studied, very well proven, mountains of data, everything that people aren't measuring just because the convenience isn't there, the cost isn't there, and everything else. And so we decided that probably, an incredible impact we could make with the company and just with our time is to make it really, really easy to collect this data and act on it. And make it more like brushing your teeth, right? Like something that could be part of your life, in a more straightforward way. So right now, people that really care about blood tests, most of them are going and getting venous draws. So they go out of their way, drive somewhere, or whatever. You have a needle stuck in their arm, tubes of blood, and days later they get a result. So it's this kind of experience that, will probably feel very antiquated, in 10 years, right? Most people will be laughing at the idea of doing that frequently. Anyway, so that's kind of the history, is that we're engineers, and we got into this a little bit circuitously, but actually a lot of my family was in medicine. So 3 out of 4 of my grandparents were doctors, and my mother's an immunologist. So I've been kind of tangentially exposed to this stuff my whole life, and accidentally ended up working. And I think it's really exciting. Another thing is just that in America, health is so poor in America on average that you're kind of forced to just grapple with it, right? Like, so all around you, 6 out of 10 Americans have chronic disease. So just everywhere around you, I mean, if you just open your eyes, you see that there's a real issue. And so it feels good to be contributing, at least in a small part, to solving that.
Gotcha. Oh, that's a great story. Yeah, so you're right. Like especially when I went on like a healing journey over several years, I got so much blood taken and I hate it. Like, it's funny. I think back when I was a kid, there was a time where I was giving blood, and I guess I passed out in the room, and it was my first experience with smelling salts. I mean, I was like a single digit ages, and it kind of always stuck with me. And because of that mildly traumatic experience, I never liked giving blood. And it was like there was a threshold of how many vials of blood I could give before I would like lights out. And not long, well, maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, I was seeing a functional doc. And one thing that functional medicine seems to do is they do a lot of upfront testing, I think to a fault, like unnecessarily. But this woman came to the house, which was like a nice luxury. The phlebotomist would come to you, and I'm sitting at my living room or my dining room table, and I see she's got like 17 vials to fill. And I'm like starting to like freak out. And I'm like, that's a lot of vials. And she's just going through the motions like, just another day at work. And I'm like, is that like going to be a problem? And she's like, no, you're going to be fine. And like, she doesn't know. She met me 5 minutes before.
Yeah.
And she's taking the vials. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, I'm starting to feel a little lightheaded. And then apparently I passed out and slid off the chair under the dining room table with the needle in my arm, and her like following me to keep the needle in place. And then I'm waking up, a few minutes later, like, what happened? So I really like like the convenience. I mean, it makes me sound like a wuss. In general, I could go and sit and give 5 or 6 vials.
I've nearly passed out. So now, because we do so much comparison testing between like the finger prick kit and the venous draws, I've done a ton of venous draws and I'm getting more used to it. But I've had one of these phlebotomists to the home when I was testing other companies' products. And the problem is that it's scheduled. So they show up at a specific time, and she called me before I had any water. I had just rolled out of bed. And usually I don't have these issues, but yeah, I nearly passed out. She had to like walk me over to a couch and all these things. And it's definitely, it's a rough experience. It's like a gruesome, brutal thing, the
yeah, I mean, you could get used to it, but I definitely don't enjoy it for sure. And so that's one of my questions. So I did the package. You guys sent me a sample to try, and I did think it was going to be pretty simple. And then when I went to do it, you only need like 8 drops of blood. So you guys send this little lancet that simply just pricks your finger. And I was surprised. I thought it would be easy to get 8 drops of blood, but I didn't
Mm-hmm.
prepare. Like the woman over the phone gave me some advice to prepare to get the blood flowing. And of course, typical guy, I didn't listen. I'll be fine. And I was also probably dehydrated first thing in the
Yeah, yeah.
morning. So I got it, but it took, I went through all the lancets. You guys send 4 lancets and you should only need one, I assume. And I
Yeah,
went
yeah,
through
yeah.
yeah, I went through all 4, but I got it, and then I got the results. And one thing that first struck out to me is my numbers, first of all, the interface is great. So
Thanks.
the ease of kind of seeing all the data, really nice. And the speed, you guys send a package that has a little piece of paper that you just drop, or some kind of fancy paper that has something you're putting the blood on. You drop a few drops of blood on, and then all the packaging, you just put it in an envelope and drop it off at the post office. And I don't even think it was a week from the time I mailed it to the time I got the email that the results were in. So that was really nice.
Yeah.
And the spread and how you guys lay out the information was nice. One thing that jumped out to me is, my numbers were quite a bit different in some of the biomarkers that maybe we'll go over some of these biomarkers you test.
Mm-hmm.
Very different than what my trends were. And my first question was like what you just alluded to, the comparison. Like, how do we know how to compare this to the typical blood tests that we're getting where you do have the vials of blood?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the
Yeah,
margin of error there? Or
that's a great question. So yeah, like I'm just I think it's probably helpful just to show this. So the kit comes with this card. It's actually, it looks simple, but it's a really interesting piece of technology. There are these when you drip a couple of drops on these squares, what happens is as the blood runs across, the cells are separated from the serum. And this is really important. Like normally they do this in a centrifuge. So they spin blood and then the cells settle out to the bottom from centrifugal force. But these cards came out about 5 years ago. We don't make this, but it's they allow the shipping, kind of shipping and handling of blood, because normally if you try to ship it with all the cells, you have to keep it on ice. It's a very tough proposition to do this kind of thing, and it really didn't take off until these cards became available. And there are many of these tests out there. Like people probably know this, but our claim to fame is that you get the most markers and it's really low cost. So we've like expanded the amount of data you get out of one of these. And of course, if you go to all this trouble, like you shouldn't have to take 4 pricks, but
right. That was
but if
my
you
fault.
yeah,
Yeah.
if you go to all this trouble, you should we believe like you should get as much as possible out of it. Companies that are a little bit more like marketing and sales focused, their thought is like, we want you to buy 4 boxes, right? So we'll sell you the inflammation box, the metabolic box, the cardio box, but we combine everything, because if you're going through this, and also it's some of it is also a matter of like the technical understanding of how to expand the set of markers. But basically, to answer your question, the blood testing industry is a very big mess, and this is rarely talked about because it's just very confusing. But essentially, the people who even create the standards, so there are these standards you can buy. There are a couple of companies that do them, like Bio-Rad, for example. When they send them to different manufacturers or run them on different machines, what they do is they actually report all those numbers, and it's like a spread. And what happens is, just the way that instruments are regulated by the FDA, you only have to show that you're equivalent to one other instrument. You don't have to, there's no standardization across the industry. And for some markers, this matters a lot because they're very complicated. So for example, vitamin D, there are a few forms of vitamin D. So you could be measuring a little bit more of this one, a little bit more of that one, like one test measure. So that causes these spreads, and it hasn't been resolved. So the industry is like this. What doctors do, of course, so the way that they live with it is they say, okay, it's all within the same bracket of the reference range. So but the reference ranges are very big, right? Because medicine is not that serious about optimization. They're just like, as long as you're here, we don't want to talk to you, right? So that, to us, like, because we want to optimize people's health, that's not enough. But for medicine, they're like, okay, as long as you're within X, maybe this tool gives you a 40 vitamin D and this tool gives you a 60. As long as you're above 20 or whatever, we don't want to talk to you. That's not anemia, goodbye, right? Or sorry, that's not a vitamin D deficiency, goodbye. So that's kind of how they live with it now. So what we do is we try to benchmark our test against different platforms. And we're open about it. So there are videos also of people, but you really have to take the test simultaneously to get a good result, because some of these things will change. Like if you take your cortisol at 9 a.m. after waking up at 8:30, and then you take it at 10 a.m., that's going to be a different number, because some of these things have, diurnal movements and all of that. The good news is that for some markers, it's really good. So like ApoB, CRP, certain things, there's like really good agreement across the industry, and certain things there's less. So what we know is that our tests, of course, they're all validated. There's a whole federal system that validates what are called CLIA lab tests. So it goes through all of that. But despite that, on certain things, like we know that LabCorp tends to give a lower vitamin D number than our test does. And there are, we've had users compare it and everything, but in general, what we try to do is make sure that our insights are matched to what we know, how we know the test runs. And the other thing is that they're self-consistent. So if you see your vitamin D going up on our test, let's say it goes from 20 to 30, that's real. Now, if you get a LabCorp test and it says your vitamin D is 15 and we say it's 20, that's probably related. That could be very much related to them using a different instrument than we do.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So
that's how it works. And this is the reality. Like if you have a really good doctor, they usually only send your blood to one lab, because they want to really see the changes consistently, right? They won't send it to two different labs, and they'll often reject results or retest results from other labs because of paranoia about like the disagreement between labs. And that's just the reality of the industry.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And being that you have the interface, I mean, even though I've only done the one sample, you could tell that when I do samples down the road, I'm going to be able to map it out and visually see my trends a lot easier than I'm used to doing it, where it's like I'm just looking through all like 5 papers of all these line items, and then I got to go back to the previous one, 6 or 12 months before and look down the line items. So I'm looking forward to seeing that the ease of the visual that you could see is going to be created as I go forward. Yeah. So at first I was kind of like pissed off. I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like my numbers can't be this. Like I'm trying to this. And then but then when I was a little bit more objective, I was talking to my wife about it. She was like, look at what you've done over the last, year and a half. I've like dramatically changed my diet and got a lot of positive things out of it, and also some not very positive things that I'm trying to like thread the needle with and kind of figure out. And I've been having people on the podcast to help me walk through some of those transitions. And when I look at the numbers, I'm like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, actually. Like what I've experienced over the last, year and a half or so is kind of being reflected by these numbers. And I took it more as, I don't know, like a wake-up call, in a way, like learning a little bit more about myself. There are some things that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I'm like trying to make sense of it. And I'm looking forward to seeing, well, what happens. Like, for instance, I was low carb for a long time, thinking like that was the thing to do. And just because I'm fairly easily sold on some things. It's a blessing and a curse. Like I'm willing to try things, and also I'm willing to try things. So I got a lot of benefits of going low carb, and then I found myself over time having some negative effects hormonally from it. And so I wanted to add carbs in, and I started to tap into, I guess, what's known as like the bioenergetic model of eating, things that resemble kind of like a Ray Peat diet or something, if you're familiar, or at least those principles. And it's been great, like in many ways, for like sleep and my energy and putting on muscle. And I went crazy doing it. Like I overcompensated. So I put on more than just muscle. Like I put on like 30 pounds over a year and a half. So I was looking
that will definitely change your blood work for sure.
And it feels, in some ways it feels great. Like picking up heavy things, it feels great. The extra weight and the extra muscle. Picking up me, like pull-ups where I'm the weight, don't feel as good as like a deadlift where it's not relative to me, but where it's not like a relative strength. But also I've brought a little bit of fat with that. And now I'm like starting to work my way down, but there was like a pretty linear ramp up as I increased all these dietary carbohydrates to try to help my metabolism and to help my hormonal thing. But then I got my blood work, and maybe we could talk a little bit about some of my blood numbers. My testosterone like went down,
Hmm.
and it had been steady climbing for years. So like when I was sick several years ago, it was in like the 300s, and then I steadily got it up to like 700,
Hmm.
which felt pretty good about. And then it like plummeted and for this last test. And I wonder, and part of me was like, well, I didn't sleep well the couple nights leading to the test. So I
Hmm.
wonder, I guess I have a question. One, do you know how much something like, getting a couple shitty nights sleep in a row leading up to the test can affect something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've done a ton of tests on ourselves and some other, and other people that started using the service early. Sometimes we would do weekly. Like we had a couple of months at the beginning where we had, 50 people doing weekly tests. So we have a pretty good data set. And we also track sleep. So, we connect all the, like I use
The
an
aura.
Aura, but we connect to, 200 different wearables and it's all in the same dashboard because we try to actually connect these things, right? How do these things affect each other? Um, Sleep is very correlated to testosterone. So we know this in our user base. So it's sleep over the past 2 weeks before you took your test, because we have sleep data, does it's like 50% of people. But this is actually interesting because it means for the other 50% of people it's not.
Hmm.
And that's why these personalized tests matter, because for some people that might not be the reason that your testosterone is where it
Gotcha.
is, right? There might be another factor. But for me, it definitely correlates. And I also had a very interesting experience recently. I mean, it's just a cool anecdote. Is basically, so I'm having I have a 3-year-old son, and my wife is pregnant again, and I noticed right around the time when she got to like the second trimester, I just, start feeling completely different. And I run these tests every month. So I look, my testosterone's way down. And I went into the literature, and it turns out that even in primates, like multiple mammals, they found that when the female's pregnant in paired mammals, she does something. Nobody knows what actually, but it increases the prolactin in the man, which inhibits testosterone production. And so there's
Interesting.
some evolutionary reason for this. So it's not clear like whether you should mess with this, but
Yeah, it's probably obvious. I mean, I would think that the woman at that point doesn't want the man going impregnating other
yes,
women. It's
stuff like that, right? So, but for me, like I don't want to have all the down, like I want to work out and have the
right.
motivation to do it and everything. So it's so basically I went and looked up like how do I inhibit prolactin production, and you can take like decent, if you take large doses of vitamin B6, it's supposed to inhibit prolactin. So I did that, and we actually measure. We have like an expansion pack that has prolactin and LH and some of the other hormones, and I did the measurements, tracked my prolactin, took the B6, and it all worked, which was amazing. I mean, in
Hmm.
biology, it's hard to get an experiment to work, especially on humans. But basically, my prolactin dropped, and then my testosterone went back up. It's
Interesting.
like
Do you
a
know
clock.
what
Yeah.
form of B6, if that was the active form or the inactive?
Um, I just took a B6 supplement that
Do you
I bought
remember what
actually
kind of?
in France because I was on vacation when I
Gotcha.
like started trying to actually deal with this. I got my numbers and I was like, oh man, I gotta just try to do something. But
Do
I'd
you
have to look
remember
it
the
up.
dose, Mike? Or
Yeah. So the pills were for people I needed because usually they put very little B6.
right?
So I had to find a very high dose, and I found one that was too high. I think it was like 250 milligrams. So
Oh,
I would take a third of the pill every day
okay.
for I think for 2 weeks is what I did,
Yeah, 250.
and I saw the effect. But this is the kind of thing that I don't know if the dose mattered that much. Like when I looked it up, people had different things to say about it. But in
Gotcha.
general, I think it's vitamin E and B6 that inhibit. And people recommend another form of B6, which I think it's called P5P. But
P5P. Yeah.
I never found that. That's the one that's supposed to be safer or something like that. But
Well, it's the I think it's the activated form. It's what your body does with it anyway. But I think the non-active form also has some important uses in the body. It's interesting. The other thing that I thought about with my scenario is I put on the weight, like, does the excess adipose tissue lower testosterone in itself, just having that? And did a little digging, and it does.
It does,
So it's like,
yeah.
okay, which made me less mad. It makes me more, gives me more confidence in the test, and it also, which makes me like use it more like responsibly, almost like, okay, let's be objective, don't get upset, your numbers, like I took it as like a hit to my ego, like when a guy sees the
Interesting.
testosterone down, it's like, oh, I'm worthless, I'm not worthy. And it was like it was good for me in hindsight. So like I'm being a little bit more, I don't want to say strategic, but like more serious about kind of changing the course I was on, so that I kind of get some of this excess weight off. It's a weird thing, threading the needle. Like I feel like gaining weight has a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
And losing weight also has a lot of benefits. And I'm tinkering with that balance. I've gone just the listeners have heard this, but just for context, like I went from 240 pounds, zero muscle, long time ago, all the way down to 153 pounds, and then up to 180 for a while. And then I just went from like 180 to like 210, 215 after being at 180 for a while. And so I've kind of gone through a big spread, and I've learned a lot in all the directions, essentially. And I feel like I'm slowly dialing it in.
Yeah, I think probably, I mean, part of this is probably just living in America, but I think a lot of people go through that kind of journey where it's like you live the standard American life, that doesn't work, right? Then you're like diet, stuff like that. And then you start trying, you try keto, you try this. But the problem is that all these things are also a little bit unnatural. So you have to figure out like which one is going to work, in your system. I read this very funny quote once. I think it was on Twitter or something, but it's like, this guy describes everything he does to get good sleep. And it's like 7 things, the eye shades, this. And he's like, and then I finally got sleep like I would 10,000 years ago if I was sleeping on a rock, in a thunderstorm or whatever, without like naked. Yeah, it's kind of, and I feel this way too. Like I have to do a lot, even at my age, I'm pretty young, but I still have to do a lot just to get, what to me is like probably what I would be getting if I just like, was a farmer or something, right? So just, and getting sun at the right time, like all these things. But if you live them, I mean, obviously I work and everything else. So if you live the modern lifestyle, it just takes a little bit of extra effort. But I think that's the problem with that is that it's not very data driven typically. And that's where like, I think we provide a lot of value, is just trying to give people more data, more tools so that they can do this, just do the optimization you're talking about for themselves. And it's important to gauge how you feel for sure, because not everything is in the blood work. Like it's not infinitely comprehensive, but it's a good tool to add to the, to the mix. I think, for example, like I'm very surprised that in terms of like mental health, people don't start with a blood test, because, psychology is incredibly complicated, right? But like the blood tests are very simple. So relative to that, right? So it's just, if that's a problem, it's very hard to compensate with, psychotherapy or whatever, or even antidepressants or whatever it is. It's very hard to compensate if you just have really bad blood work. Like I think typical people with depression will have very high inflammation. And so it's like, okay, maybe there's something you can do to fix that first. And then if you still, not feeling great, okay, let's go through all this other stuff, which is like a big rabbit hole, right? And so that to me is one area which is not as well studied. Like I think with diets, people know that's going to affect your blood work, but like psychologically, that's not very, that's not fully connected yet. I think that's one area that's very important. And it's being, of course, like in academia, it's well known. But it's not something that's like out in the wild actually being applied that much.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I noticed on one of the first things I looked for on the test was, do you test fasting insulin? And that's something that seems to be also very well known in academia, whatever, that how important and simple that is, your fasting insulin, yet in application, it's still not tested generally when you go to get your normal blood work. And from what I understand, it's not an expensive test. It's not hard for the doc to add that check to the box. But there's like a disconnect between what we know in the literature and what is common practice. So it's nice to have that number. The fasting insulin, from what I understand, is maybe one of the best things to look at, to just get a snapshot of your overall like metabolic health. Whereas the other data, there's like a lot more to interpret associated with metabolic health, where that is like a real simple thing, that if your insulin's really high right when you wake up and you haven't had food recently, there's a problem. Like, that shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the top, if you had to just, if you pick a random person out of a hat in America and you say, what's going to be off? Fasting insulin, right? Because even before your glucose, so what the way the medical system works now is they wait for you to lose glucose control. So they say, okay, you're out of control, your glucose is really high, but that's a control system that runs on, basically insulin is what insulin and glucagon are controlling the level of glucose. So that means that at some point, your whole body went out of whack and you have to start producing more and more insulin to keep your glucose down. And at some point, you can't even produce enough insulin and your glucose starts to rise. The average level of, and that's what they measure typically. It's called HbA1c. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it's right. HbA1c is measured, if you do your yearly physical, they'll measure that. And that's the 3-month average of your glucose levels. It's a protein that ends up getting, it has a chemical reaction with glucose. So you can it has a 3-month lifetime. So if the amount of it will tell you. And this is like the last thing, right? So once that's far out of range, you're pre-diabetic, and they'll tell you, okay, you're pre-diabetic. And they maybe don't even say it that seriously, that harshly, but that's like, you're already very far down the road. So probably 10 years ago, you started losing control of this system and your insulin started creeping up and everything. So that's an incredibly important one. And another one that's like overlooked, but very powerful, is trig to HDL, triglycerides to HDL ratio. And there's a ton of research that supports that trig to HDL. And we see this in our data because we take these broad tests. We see a lot of correlation between trig HDL and like inflammation or metabolic fitness issues. So like high fasting insulin, this kind of thing. So tracking trig HDL and getting that, to like 2 or less that's probably something that people are overlooking as well. But I think fasting insulin is the most direct and simple. Like you're saying, it just shouldn't be high in the morning. There's no reason. It means that you have insulin resistance.
Gotcha. Can you speak at all? I don't know if this is your wheelhouse, but what trig to HDL really represents biochemically, or?
Yeah, so I think it's, so what happens is, they take these measurements. The nice thing about, and this is how we choose our markers basically for the panel, we try to go after the ones that are measured frequently enough where there is a ton of data on them. So for example, normally you don't get your ferritin measured. That's the protein that carries iron, but enough people do that we have a ton of data on ferritin, right? And we know that it kind of, a lot of things about what it means. So we don't go after like very esoteric stuff. Trig HDL, I think people just do the statistics. And that's the first thing that happens. They're like, oh man, this really correlates to, whatever, diabetes. This really correlates to cardiovascular disease. What's the mechanistic reason? Probably, high triglycerides implies some kind of metabolic dysfunction because you're not able, that's like the short-term fats. It's kind of like the glucose of fat. So you're not controlling that well. If those are too high, you're supposed to convert them to another. This is not my area, okay, I have to say. But you can think of it, it's similar to glucose, where the triglycerides are too high. The reason you have HDL in that formula is because the overall level of cholesterol maybe doesn't matter as much as the relative levels. So they use it as like a normalization factor. And so probably what really matters is whether you're able to control your triglycerides relative to the rest. Gotcha. So it's like, how's your body converting those into long-term fats and things like that.
That's another thing that I saw in my test, that my numbers changed dramatically. My cholesterol numbers, which were going up steadily with like a low carb diet for years. Mm-hmm. And I was convinced that that wasn't something to be upset about until I felt like I had some signs of reduced metabolism. And then I learned that, well, you need thyroid to basically convert the cholesterol to downstream products. So elevated cholesterol more so as an indicator of a slowing metabolism, which was
Hmm.
consistent with a low carb diet. So I was like,
Yeah.
okay, this is starting to make sense. So I've been eating all these carbs and my cholesterol plummeted,
Yep.
like
Yep. Yep.
cut in half, like all. So I think that's good, but I'm not 100% sure. Like I don't feel fine. Might want to get an image at some point. I'm 46, so maybe like get a CAT scan when I'm like 50 or I don't know. But it's just interesting. Like, wow, it did what I thought it should do. It did it
Yeah.
more than I thought it should do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then there's like I said, I'm trying to thread a needle. So that on the surface seems positive, I think, because it means, yeah, maybe my thyroid is up and running and I am converting. But if I am converting, well, I had my testosterone drop, but maybe that's for other reasons. And then the other thing that stood out was my HbA1c, the thing that you mentioned, who's always been normal up until
Hmm.
this like higher carb experimentation started to creep up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's all.
yeah, but I've also been like not even cautious about carbs. Like I've
Yeah.
been staying regularly carbohydrated and sugared like
Mm.
from morning to night.
Mm.
So now I'm like getting more responsible. Say, okay, I'm gonna cut down the number of meals. I'm not gonna have like sugary things between meals and just have this
Hmm.
like constant bombarded and just try to be more like the experts advise, I guess, in that field. Instead of at first, I was just like, I wanted such abundant signals to my body. I wanted my
Mm.
body to understand I'm never going to starve you of carbs again. So if there's any metabolically expensive activity that you've been waiting to do, but felt you didn't have, that you didn't have the safe environment to do it, I just want you to know you do. And I wanted to like get through that. And I was like, I'm totally okay with gaining weight. I just want to get out of this kind of scarcity feel
Hmm.
sense in my body. And now I'm like, okay, I ran that course and I want to like just wiggle my way back down to balance. But it's very interesting how all these things are interacting and they seem to make sense
Have
when
you ever tried a
context.
continuous glucose monitor?
I did, yeah. But I
Ah,
did it
okay.
while I was doing low carb, but then I learned um I'm not sure now that I learn more about how metabolism governs so kind of everything and how crucial sugar is in the blood and how we're always having adaptive responses to
Hmm.
regulate it. I didn't find it as useful because if your blood sugar, like I always looked at blood sugar should be as low as possible.
Yeah, that's
And that's a
probably
problem.
that's a one-sided view, right? That's for sure. So that's interesting that you bring that up. I mean, the reason I mentioned the CGM is when you're keto, it's actually not very interesting because it's just flat,
Flat, yeah.
right? But or more or less, unless you exercise, like when you exercise, even if you're fasting, you'll have a spike. But it's interesting when you're actually eating like a more diverse diet. There are all these hacks that people have come up with or studied, and some of them, it's very funny, just end up being things that are traditional. So, for example, Chinese people eat a lot of rice, and they always take walks after big meals. That's like a
Right.
standard thing. Take a walk after, and that is their recommendation from
Deposes the sugar.
from however many studies and
Right,
all
right,
these things. It basically helps you absorb the sugar into your muscles. So
right.
if you're sitting after the big meal, you don't get the same level of absorbance into the muscle, so you get a bigger spike. And there are a couple of these other things. It's like eating your protein and fiber before the sugar. And I found this is probably my weakest area, the metabolic health stuff in general. So I'm interested in this, and I've done a bunch of these experiments on myself. And this stuff just works. Like not all of it, it's again personal. For some things, some foods are going to be different than others, and all these things. But that's one reason why we're not, by no means like really focused on the continuous glucose monitor. We don't have an app around it. Like some companies build an app
Right.
and kind of make it a really, you can really drill into your glucose control. But we do offer CGMs. We just basically managed to, we set up like a fulfillment system for it where you can get it through us.
Gotcha.
For some reason in America, you have to get a prescription to get this. It's like a mafia, right?
Right.
In
Yeah.
in Canada, you can buy them at Costco.
Oh,
Uh, you
it's a
know,
great tool. I just feel like
uh,
it's a great tool for like 2 weeks.
yes, yeah, you do it once or twice, once in a while, and you see, okay, is what I'm doing what I think it's
Right.
doing, right? But anyway, that's one thing that I found useful for me just to calibrate, like, and that does have downstream effects on HbA1c, right? Because it's just averaging that number. And if you have these, like you eat a ton of glucose and then you go to sleep, that's going to have, you're very bad at absorbing it while you sleep. So you're going to have this like really big, long spike overnight. And that's how you end up with the higher HbA1c number. Sometimes it depends on the person, but
Right, but there's also, like you
that's one
mentioned,
thing that I
hacks.
found for myself.
You
Yep,
mentioned
yep,
hacks. Like sometimes you could just add fat and slow
yeah,
that down so
yeah,
that it
yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
go as
yeah,
high, and that way it helps you sleep and you go
yep.
deeper before your cortisol rises. It helps you sleep through the night. Like I have a history of having not enough carbohydrate,
Mm.
running out of glucose for my
Oh, and
nervous
having
system
that
to run on
spike.
in the middle of the night, and then waking up with a cortisol spike,
Uh,
and it's 2 hours before I want to get up.
yeah, those are keto problems. That's like a keto problem, right?
Yeah. So when I had, but
That's
if I have
funny.
like a bowl of ice cream before bed, that doesn't happen.
Hmm,
So
very
it's like, well,
interesting.
how do I thread that needle? Which turns out people have been doing for a long time. People have been having like
Yeah,
milk and honey or
yeah,
some
yeah.
kind of like fat and sugar. So you have
Mm-hmm.
this slow drip
Yeah, yeah.
because to some extent, sugar is anti cortisol.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when blood sugar goes down, you have hormones like cortisol or adrenaline that whose job is to get more energy available.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they will spike. Um, what other markers go over like the other markers that you guys look at on the basic tests that you offer?
So one thing is, I mean, we're really focused on chronic disease prevention, health optimization, right? That's the area. So we don't really overlap much with your yearly blood test. We're really looking at things that they don't normally measure until you have a lot of symptoms. We have a couple things that overlap just because we believe those should be measured more often. So we do very important one. This is if we had to just have one marker, maybe this would be it. Is HSCRP? That's not measured enough at all. So that's the general inflammation marker, and it's downstream of a lot of inflammatory processes. So that's correlated to all cause mortality. It's very important, and you want to get it down below 1, basically. Some people try to get it below 0.5, but that's the ideal world, is like it's below 1. Average American is at 2.5. So there's a lot of inflammation. Where does it come from? It's a mix of possible. So it really depends. People report getting rid of mold in their house and having it go down. Changing your diet, of course. Like a lot of it can be like just from eating a lot of processed food, but it really depends. So you can't, you have to start kind of going deeper to figure out like how to get it down, but it's important to track it. And the other thing is, I mean, sometimes if you get a bacterial infection, it's supposed to go high. That's what it's for, but it shouldn't be basally elevated. That's a big issue. So that's one that we think is really important. We track morning cortisol because people's circadian rhythms are messed up. A lot of it is due to blue light and other factors like blue light at night. So we also actually will shift, like we have a membership option that's kind of like the everything membership, and we always include blue light blockers with that.
Oh, nice.
Like just because people won't buy them if you have to charge them for it, but we just include them because if 10% of people use them, that's already a big win.
And do you notice
There's
that when do you notice the blue light blockers help as it shows up on the morning cortisol test?
So in people where we know that they're using them, yes, but it's we don't know what's going on. We don't collect a lot of data currently about our users, so we don't really know if they're using them. But we do it as like a just we know they work, so it's we just provide them, and some people already have them, of course. So we just source a good pair and send them because it's so important, and because the circadian rhythm just has a lot of effects on everything. So if you have that screwed up, that's one of the first things to focus on because you can fix it. For most people, it's fixable. Depends. I mean, if you have a night job or whatever, it's very tough to fix. But so that's one that we're really interested in. And again, we also track sleep, and so it goes well together. There's also for lipids, ApoB and ApoA are much better measure than LDL and HDL. They're essentially the same thing, except LDL HDL measures the total amount of these lipids, whereas ApoB and ApoA measures the number of particles. And the number of particles is more important. It turns out it has the mechanism of how your arteries get clogged or whatever matters more how many of these particles you have. And that's very well proven. It's all really 20 years already. This has been understood. Doctors don't measure ApoB unless you're going to a functional medicine doctor. That's just how it is. There's a guy, Peter Attia, that talks about this all the time.
Right.
It was the Drive podcast. But basically, we measure that and LDL HDL, so you can see both. And we think that's important because sometimes you have normal lipids, but then the ApoB is off, and you want to address that through diet or statins or whatever. We don't.
Do you know what the dietary interventions are to address ApoA or ApoB?
I think it's the same things as the lipids. So it's like fiber. There are some specific types of fiber that tend to help. There are actually people are coming out with like kind of like a like protein bar type thing, but to lower your cholesterol. I think those are interesting. We're going to experiment with some users and see if they actually work. And then there's like omega-3s, eating more, olive oil and fish. I think those are the major things that people recommend. I might be missing something. And then there are statins also, which are controversial. I don't know if I can't recommend somebody statins, but a lot of people recommend them, of course. But they might have some other effects that we don't understand. So it's like,
and you mentioned you don't collect a lot of data. Do you share any data? Do people have to worry about like doing this and then all of a sudden they go to get life insurance and they can't because
so we don't share any private data. A lot of people are worried. I don't know where this comes from, but there must be some meme going around that people are worried that we'll get their DNA. We don't save any of the sample. We don't measure DNA. We only measure proteins and hormones, which are totally unrelated to DNA, and we don't keep the sample. And of course, the data is all private. There's a lot of regulations around this. We do collect the metadata, so we pool everyone's data together into an anonymized, essentially spreadsheet, and we do a lot of computation on that to try to improve our insights. So and you're benefiting from all the other users' information. So from that perspective, we do that, but we don't actually. There's no way that an individual's data is going anywhere, where it's linked to who they are.
Gotcha. I did have a question. Getting back to the things you test, I noticed you tested, I think one marker for thyroid, I think was TSH.
Mm-hmm.
Is there packages to test for more thyroid related things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, in our, base panel, we think TSH is a good start because, if that's in range, there's a good chance that, things are working. And of course, if it's elevated, it means your body's like telling your thyroid, please produce more, and maybe it's not working. So it's kind of an early warning sign. We do have we have these add-ons that we've launched. So we already have the Hormone Plus add-on. So for women, it's a bunch of hormones plus some like B12 and folate. And then for men, it's hormones plus PSA. So tracking your prostate specific antigen. And if that starts going up, then, you need to get checked out basically for potential like prostate issues, and maybe even cancer. So usually that's not tracked very well, and so we're kind of adding that so you get a baseline, and then we're launching what we call the Thyroid Plus, hopefully within a month, and that'll do T3, free T3, free T4, and TPO.
Oh, nice! I would like that. You said that launches in about a month.
Yeah. And so the way that works is it's basically, so there are 2 strips on the card, and we ship another half card. So it's like 1 strip and you fill that up and you get the results. So it's not a whole separate kit. It's just an additional card in the same kit, and there's an additional fee, but it basically allows you to, in a single collection, get more data.
Does that mean so you don't need more drops of blood? Is it the same?
You need more, but you don't have to go through.
Gotcha.
Once you're doing it, it's much easier, right? It's the way I view it, it's like the activation energy. Once you have it working, it's and you've done all the preparation, everything, it's easy to fill 3 strips.
I don't know, man.
2.
That 7th and 8th drop took a lot for me to get out.
It's so people get very good at this over time. So when I started, when we were doing this, we were testing other people's tests, and we found that one of the major things is, how you prepare for it, whether you have variable size lancets. So people have very different skin thicknesses. So we offer 2 different lancet sizes, so that you can actually tune that. And that makes a big difference for like the pain level, how fast it heals and things like that. So we have the smaller lancet. And that's the one I use actually. I've like gotten to the point where I can do one of the small lancets and that's it. But it takes all the preparations, like heating your hand up, having, lots of water before. Sometimes I'll do some weightlifting. Actually, that's very effective. I'll
But
do
that
like
doesn't throw off like some of these numbers. That was
uh,
my concern. I didn't want
not
to
if
like
you
throw
not if
off
you do it
cortisol.
immediately. So if you go and do a set of deadlift and then just prick your finger right away, there's not enough time between that and the prick to for your body to generate anything. So it's
Okay.
as long as you do it right away, that for me works very well. But yeah, just heating your hand up with hot water, that's the stand. That's really the most
But that could
important.
affect blood. But you so you're not testing glucose level, all right?
We don't test
Okay.
glucose levels
So you don't
because
have.
there's so many ways to do that, and the CGM anyway we think is like a
Gotcha.
better approach. So we
Gotcha.
we just
Okay.
we do HbA1c and fasting insulin, which are more stable and I think a deeper result than
Okay.
glucose.
Any
Yeah.
other tests that you do that you want to mention? Did we cover
Um.
them all?
Yeah, we've covered a lot. I mean, we do again like expanded hormone panel because of often whatever, let's say low testosterone or something, it's interesting to look deeper and see is it your LH is low or whatever. So there are different reasons it could be, and so that's a valuable one, and that people often request. We mostly just launch. Besides the base panel, we just launch what people ask for.
Gotcha.
Um, so that's a big one, and then yeah, I think one thing that we're doing, which we're collecting interest for, so it's very likely we'll launch this also in a month or two, is for a lot of people, like sometimes the thing you have to do to upgrade your blood work is just supplements, right? So that's like one of the first easy hacks. So for certain things, there are supplements that'll do it, and so we're partnering with a company that does supplements for a lot of the sports teams and like Olympic teams, and just doing a pass through. Like we try to come up with ways to make it easy for people to do something, right? So we're just gonna put together some panels of supplements so that you can quickly just get something and try it and see if it helps you. That's
Okay.
in the pipeline. And in terms of the things we actually test, I think ferritin is a very underappreciated marker. We did not know this ourselves actually when we launched with ferritin. We were just looking for anemia, and in women you do find anemia, or also in vegetarians. That's the two groups where you typically find not enough iron, and that's like a ferritin I believe below 30. But we're occasionally finding people with very very high ferritin, and that's it turns out there's a condition called hemochromatosis. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, where you will lose, at least according to one person that we've talked to a lot, he was the first one we found, and we didn't believe the number. We're like, you have to go get tested at LabCorp because this number is crazy. It's like tenfold the normal ferritin level, and it turned out it was real. And so his doctor basically, they never tested him for this. He had all kinds of health problems. Nobody ever tested it for some
Hmm.
reason, and it's easy to deal with. So he's got his ferritin down now. I think he's just giving blood. That's all it is. And I'm pretty sure that's what they prescribed him to do because there's not like a clear treatment. It's like semi-hereditary, and he says that it's going to add like 10 to 15 years to his life. So basically, this is because if he had just let it go, it was going to worsen and worsen, and the symptoms would get much worse. So he was already feeling like joint pain and fatigue and all these things. And so that we occasionally find people with that, and so that's one that I think is very underappreciated because it's probably latently there, and people are just not getting diagnosed.
Gotcha.
It's relatively rare, but I mean, if you're already not feeling great, you probably have a higher chance that that's going on.
Right.
So that's one that I was surprised. We that's something we learned honestly from doing this. Having thousands and thousands of people take the test.
Nice. The other thing that is nice, and for the listeners, if you're wondering, when you get the test, there's like insights for each category. So if you have something that's like out of range, there's a little insight. But also, you guys offer some consults with a doctor to go over, and I haven't taken advantage of it yet, but I plan to, and it's really reasonably priced, which was
So one
nice
of the
to
reasons
see.
it's reasonably priced is it's not a doctor
Oh,
technically,
okay.
so it's not a medical. It's a coaching session.
Coaching session. Okay.
The interesting thing is that we end up typically using MDs for the coaching sessions anyway, but it's not practicing MDs. So it's people that are not licensed and they're not so, or they're in a different. So we have an MD from England who is practicing there, but we don't give medical advice. So we don't prescribe medicine. We don't diagnose you with any disease. What we do is like help you interpret, instead of reading a bunch of the articles we have about what do the markers mean and all these things, we give you all the context. And then we also put together a plan. And the plan is, again, similar to the insights, but deeper, because we find out more about the person. So we collect lots of information. We don't, right now, if you take our test, we don't even ask, I mean, this is something we're planning to add, but we don't even ask you your height and weight or anything like that. So we just give you, and there's some people prefer it that way, honestly, but in the coaching sessions, it goes a lot deeper. And that's another thing where that's not a profit center for us. That's why it's so low cost. We just try to scrape by where we're not losing money on doing that. And we'll see if we can keep it at $39. I think we actually do lose money on it right now. Okay. But the idea is just to, the company was very long-term focused, because our goal is eventually to have a device in the home rather than this card. So that's really where we're headed over the next couple of years. Yeah. And we have prototypes. So this is how it looks. So the chip is in there, and that does the blood test. So that's really like the long-term vision of the company. And for that reason, we're just trying to learn about how to make blood tests valuable for people. And so the coaching is part of that, just trying to make it useful, right? So rather than necessarily like short-term making that a profit center, we just want to scale up how people use the blood test, how much value they get out of them and things like that. And that's why we have all these ancillary services around them.
Gotcha. That's cool. I also like, there's some flexibility. So I have to be careful, because there was a time where I would overdo things like this. So I'm glad that there's like some options of like how conservative or aggressive or how crazy or sane do you want to be? Like you mentioned, you test every month, but it's your company. For the average person that just wants to track, that cares about their health and likes to play offense as opposed to defense, like wants to be preventative and not wait for the shit to hit the fan and then like wait for the medical system to try to figure it out when their incentives are in weird places. It seems like I do not have good history of getting from A to B successfully through the Western medical model, nor does like anyone in my family. Like I don't have a lot of, I've become a cynic, I guess. And I have some good good experiences with like functional and integrative docs, but also like it can get really expensive. And sometimes it's just overkill. Like the best thing is to be your own advocate and like play a bigger role, and then rely on those systems as needed, really as little as needed, like as much as you need, but also as little as you need for your own sanity and like a balanced lifestyle. And this is where I think it's nice. And you guys offer different approaches as far as frequency and the price. It's like a membership thing from what I understand, but the price is based on how often you want to take the test. So there's like quarterly options or yearly options from what I understand.
So I think the way it works is, if you're just going to take one test, probably the thing to do is to get the yearly, and you just get a test per year. You can always cancel it. And it's priced such that we mostly want people, we highly not want, but we just, if people were reasonable, we would just have one option, because the third option is actually just straightforward and probably the best for most people, unless they just want to try one test. And which is, we recommend really getting a baseline, at least over time, even if it's like 2 tests a year. But the best option probably for most people is, it's called the unlimited membership. And this is made so that you can test a la carte. So we send you a box. It's got 2 kits in it. If you add on the continuous glucose monitor, you get that as well, or the hormone plus whatever. But the base thing, it's got 2 kits, and then the blue light blockers that we just try to get everybody to use, and then some other stuff like extra lancets, whatever. It's a starter kit, like a hand warmer. And so we give that to people, and we just charge $16 a month to have access to the membership. And that includes everything we do, the coaching, whatever. But then when you do something, you just pay for that, and it's your choice. So let's say you take a test, we bill you the $95 for the test, and then we send you another kit. And if you don't use that kit, you don't get billed. And so it's more like that. So you can choose, let's say you're trying an experiment, you can take a test every 2 weeks, and then you can pause for a year, right? Or whatever it is. So it kind of depends on, because at the beginning, we had a monthly membership, and there were people that wanted more frequently. They wanted to test like every 2 weeks, because they were doing something. Maybe they were preparing for a marathon or whatever it is. And there were people who were like got the monthly membership because of the best price, but then they would have the kits pile up. And we don't want that either, right? So it's just we realized that there's so much heterogeneity amongst people, like what they want to do, that we just made a membership where it's all like it's just as you go. And so that's the one that I recommend. But we also have the legacy stuff. It's like a yearly and a quarterly that will like show up at your door at a fixed time.
Gotcha. I feel like for me personally, the quarterly is a good thing to keep me responsible, but also in check, because I don't want to go down those rabbit holes, because I know myself. Like, I don't want to get obsessed with it, because there was a time where I got obsessed about health things, and it's great until it isn't. And, everybody's different. So it's nice to have the flexibility where if it's out of sight, out of mind, I might go 2 years without a test, and I don't want that. So I like the idea that it just shows up every 3 months.
That's interesting. I haven't thought of that. It's a reminder to do it in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's, fortunately, there's a lot of different personalities out there, and otherwise, this Earth place would suck. But it's interesting. Like, there might be different models that you haven't thought of yet that wind up emerging. It sounds like you're still kind of in the infancy stage of this process, but a bright future. It's really exciting to see what you held up a moment ago about the in-house. Like, I would have never even considered that till you mentioned it. So that's exciting. So down the road, years from now, you won't have to deal with something in the mail. You'll just have a device, and then you'll have something in your house and your computer that just kind of reads it for you, or will still need to be sent to you guys?
Yeah, so it's a much longer process to get something approved for the home, because there's the way that it works now, it goes to a lab with large instruments, FDA cleared. There's a lab director who's a very experienced scientist who controls everything, right? So that's an easier process to launch a blood test, and that's why we went with this, because we just wanted to start serving customers as soon as possible.
Gotcha.
Because we knew like there's a gap in the market, people need this. This is really the core technology of the company, and the bottleneck for this is part of it is engineering, but a lot of it is you have to do a ton of rigorous testing to get approval to be on the market with something like this. But it will never fully replace mail-in tests. So we'll always have probably a combination, because certain markers are measured so rarely, like you don't really need to measure them that often. So there's no reason to develop them on a home test.
Okay.
And but as we expand our menu, we're going to add more of those rarer markers to help people like figure out what's going on with them, and at the same time try to move the markers that you measure frequently onto these home cartridges. So
Gotcha.
it'll always be like a mix of different approaches. But the mail-in testing has a lot of benefits because it's so flexible. But of course, this decreases the amount of blood, which is really important. It makes it just much easier to take the test, and it also gives you the result right away. So and the cost will drop because of the less shipping. Everything's better. It's like a tenfold.
That's really exciting to hear where this is going. I do think blood testing is super useful, and it sounds like you're on the cutting edge here, and kind of grateful that you guys are doing what you're doing. I'm grateful that I have access to do this now, and I appreciate it. And I think for the listeners out there, if you're interested in monitoring your blood, give it a try. And if you don't feel well, this is you might get just the insight you need to lead you the right direction down whatever healing journey that awaits you. Mike, I want to thank you for taking the time to reach out to us. From what I understand, you guys are offering a discount on the Siphox product for our listeners. I will confirm this, but I think it's using code MINDFUL at checkout. And we'll go ahead and link that into the show notes for the listeners. Mike, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we're good. We covered a lot of ground here. It's thanks a lot for having me on, and I think it's really a pleasure to be doing this, and it's as we're growing, it's just it's really rewarding to see people getting benefit from this, and being able to be like a conduit for people to like start or improve whatever they're doing to fix their health. I mean, I've had a lot of like my family has had a ton of health issues, and this is something that I think would have been impactful if they had it 10 or 20 years ago. So for me, it's just like something I really enjoy getting this out to the world. And so thanks for giving me a chance to talk to a lot of people at once.
My pleasure, man. I also grateful to be a conduit for the message you're putting out there for these products. Thanks a lot. And for the listeners out there, always grateful for your listening. I hope everybody enjoyed. I hope you have a great day. Thanks again for tuning in, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. It's kind of exciting. It just makes you wonder how things are going to change in the field of medicine going forward. I feel like we're on the brink of just dramatic changes over the next 5 or 10 years. And I think this is kind of right at the heart of that. And I love that it gives kind of more power, more control to the individual. I do feel that you really have to be your own advocate these days and use experts to help guide you and not hand so much of your power over to them. They're only humans. They don't walk on water. And sometimes if we trust too much and wait for them to do all the things for us to fix our own health, it doesn't go well. So at the Mindful Movement, I'm an advocate for playing a bigger role in your sense of well-being, and this is right at the heart of that. So I'm excited for our listeners to get an opportunity to try this new technology. And if you do, let the community know what you think. Thanks again for listening. Have a great day.